Why did German planes from World War II use a spiral on the propeller cone? This is something very curious about German planes, which in fact we still see in modern planes. People usually have their theories about it, but the answer to this question is quite unexpected. To answer this question, we need to give some historical context. The airplanes for military use in World War II were very varied. In this conflict, many circumstances collided that made the role of aircraft increasingly prominent. Thus, airplanes for military use became one of the main weapons to use in combat. The Germans in particular had a wide range of aircraft that, regarding the topic of the video, had quite varied paintings. They had camouflages of all kinds, and even quite strange colors to see on a combat aircraft like yellow. All these designs had a very specific function, including of course the characteristic spiral painted on the propeller cones. There are many myths around this curious pattern. The most popular was that the design was merely aesthetic. The truth is that at that time, armies never wasted resources on making a weapon look nice. In fact, in those years it was very common that with the intention of maximizing the production of weaponry or military equipment, manufacturers cared very little about the finish of what they produced, to a greater or lesser extent depending on the nation. An example of this is the deep willies of the American Army. Inside it had protruding screws that were poorly cut, and parts of the body protruded quite a bit, making it dangerous to be inside them. In a sudden movement of the vehicle, if you put your hand in a bad place, you could cut yourself. So the myth of aesthetics is not correct. The reality is that the spirals were specifically to protect ground personnel. In the scare of said conflict, we saw a gigantic technological advance that not only applied to the aircraft themselves, but also applied to aerodromes. In the 30s, a great variety of military aircraft of all sizes and utilities emerged that was not only limited to bombers as in the past, that aerodromes had to deal with a lot of planes of all sizes and each of them had specific needs. So for efficient operation ground personnel was vital, particularly in Germany. Several men were needed for each plane, regardless of its size, to be loaded with armament and fuel, while the pilot performed the controls to start the flight. In this way, in an attack, the Germans could put up to 6 planes per minute in flight. For this reason, it was common to have ground personnel performing their functions very close to the propellers, with the engines on. It was also normal for the planes to be quite close and that they were constantly moving, making the aerodromes a quite dangerous place that on a bad day could cause injuries or some fatality among the ground personnel. The staff had to be very attentive and paying a lot of attention, because in a moment of carelessness the worst could happen. The spiral-shaped marks on the propeller cone were precisely for the staff to distinguish it. Look at it closely, it's quite hypnotic. In fact, it's quite hard to ignore. For the brain, remember that if you're distracted, it's hard to see if the propeller engine is on, because the propellers are not visible, the noise gives them away. But if you're surrounded by a bunch of running engines, obviously you won't be able to distinguish where the noise is coming from. The propeller cones with the painted spiral you could see perfectly. If the plane is on or off, even on windy days, or the propellers could spin in the opposite direction, so the spiral could serve to see in which direction the propellers were spinning. In addition, it is also often said that they were used to prevent collisions between planes on busy runways or even in the air. Although I read this in an article, so I don't know if this is true. This is something quite common to see in most of these German planes, particularly in the small ones, the Bf-109 and Fw-190, but in the bombers this was not at all common to see. In the Allied Air Forces this practice never became widespread, although cases were seen of planes with these characteristics. Interestingly, this practice is still preserved today. Many commercial aircraft manufacturers add these spirals to the engines to protect ground personnel, specifically to know how fast the engine is spinning and thus know how far to stay away from it. Also, let's remember that one of the biggest causes of commercial airplane accidents is birds getting into the engines. A study by a Japanese airline says that the spiral not only serves to keep humans away from the engines, but also birds. There's no doubt that human ingenuity is quite impressive, and it shows us that a simple idea can solve complex problems.